"Can I have whatever is left?" she whispered, eyes fixed on the dirt floor. "Even just the scraps." The cook's ladle froze midair. The kitchen went silent. And then from the doorway came a voice that cut through the stillness like a blade through dry grass. "Sit down." Hugh Denore didn't raise his voice. He never had to. "You eat like everyone else at this ranch. Every last one of you heard me." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. If you've ever been told you weren't worth a full plate, this story is for you. Subscribe to our channel. Follow Mary's journey all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. We want to see how far this story travels. The wagon that brought Mary Collins to Denore Ranch didn't slow down for her. It slowed down because the front wheel hit a rut deep enough to crack the axle, and the driver swore so loud the horses flinched. By the time the man had climbed down to assess the damage, Mary had already gathered her cloth bag from the flatbed, stepped off the side rail without a word, and started walking the remaining quarter-mile on foot. She had been doing that her whole life, not waiting for things to stop for her, just walking anyway. She was 22 years old, though the summer heat and the last 3 months of traveling had put years on her face that didn't belong there yet. Her dress had been blue once. Now it was the color of dust. The hem had torn somewhere outside of San Antonio, and she'd knotted it rather than let it drag, which gave her stride a slight irregularity, not a limp, but something close. Her boots were cracked at the toe of the right foot. The cloth bag she carried had a broken strap she'd replaced with braided twine. She had 31 cents and a folded letter that had been read so many times the creases had gone soft. The letter was from a woman named Agnes Pruitt, who had worked at Denore Ranch for 11 years before her knees gave out entirely, and she'd gone back to her sister's house in Galveston. Agnes had been Mary's mother's oldest friend, and when Mary's mother died in April, fever 3 days, no warning, Agnes had written a single practical letter. Not about grief, not about sorrow, just the facts Denore Ranch in Callahan County needs a kitchen helper. Hugh Denore is a hard man, but a fair one. Tell him Agnes sent you. He won't turn you away. Mary had read that letter every day since. She read it like other women read scripture. She needed it to be true. The first thing she heard when she came within earshot of the ranch yard was laughter. Not warm laughter. The kind that comes at someone's expense before they're close enough to know it. There were 4 men standing near the fence line, and she could feel all 4 of them looking at her without turning to look back at them. She had learned that particular skill early in life, how to feel a stare without answering it. How to keep walking without flinching. "Lord have mercy," one of them said loud enough to carry. "What did the wind drag in?" "Somebody's laundry," another said. The laughter rolled out again, easy and comfortable, the kind of laughter that belongs to men who have never had to wonder where their next meal was coming from. Mary adjusted the strap of her bag and kept walking. The main house sat at the center of the yard, a wide structure with a long porch that looked like it had been added on in sections over the years. Some boards weathered dark, some still carrying a trace of raw wood where repairs had been made. Beside it, separated by a covered walkway, was the kitchen building, and she could smell it before she reached the door. Wood smoke, salt pork, something with onions. Her stomach made a sound she was grateful no one was close enough to hear. She knocked on the kitchen door frame and waited. The woman who appeared was wide-shouldered and wore her sleeves rolled to the elbow. Her hair was pulled back so tight it looked like a deliberate act of severity. She held a long wooden spoon in one hand and looked Mary up and down the way a person appraises a horse, not unkindly, but without any pretense. "What is it?" the cook said. "My name is Mary Collins." She kept her voice steady. That was the one thing she'd practiced on the wagon. Steady voice. Don't beg. "Agnes Pruitt told me to come. She said Mr. Denore might have use for a kitchen helper." The cook's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes shifted. "Agnes sent you?" "Yes, ma'am." The cook looked at her bag, at her dress, at the knotted hem. "When did you last eat?" Mary opened her mouth and then closed it. The answer was yesterday morning. Half a biscuit she'd bought in Abilene with 5 cents and eaten over the course of 2 hours to make it feel like more. But she didn't want to say that. She didn't want to start this way with pity as the foundation. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Mary said instead. "I can work. I'm good at keeping books too, if that's useful." Agnes said. "I heard what Agnes said," the cook interrupted. "Come inside." Mary stepped into the kitchen, and the heat of it hit her like a wall. 3 large pots on the stove, a table crowded with cut onions, a side of beef hanging from a hook near the back door. It was the most food she had seen in one place in months, and she had to work very deliberately to keep her eyes from dwelling on it. The cook set down her spoon and crossed her arms. "I'm Dolores. I run this kitchen. Mr. Denore runs everything else. You'll work under me, follow my directions, not cause trouble with the hands, and not make promises you can't keep. Agnes's word carries weight here, but it doesn't carry it forever. You understand?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good." Dolores turned back to the stove. "Supper's in 2 hours. I could use help with—" And then Mary did it. She didn't plan it. She had planned to be composed, to be professional, to ask nothing until she had proven herself. But her stomach hollowed itself out at exactly the wrong moment, and her throat went dry. And something about the smell of that kitchen, the warmth of it, the sheer ordinary abundance of it, cracked something open in her chest that she had been keeping sealed very carefully for a very long time. "Excuse me," she said quietly. "Before we start, is there anything left over from earlier? Whatever wouldn't be missed." She swallowed. "Even just the scraps." The word scraped against her tongue. She hated it. She said it anyway. Dolores turned slowly. The spoon was still in her hand. She looked at Mary for a long moment, and in that moment Mary felt every version of herself, the capable one, the composed one, the one who had survived and kept walking, flicker like a candle in wind. "Can I have whatever is left?" she whispered, eyes dropping to the floor. "Even just the scraps." Dolores's ladle froze midair. "She's probably here for scraps," said a voice from outside, and the laughter followed it through the open door, like something carried on a current. Mary didn't look up, and then the footsteps came. Not heavy exactly, but purposeful. The kind of footsteps that move through a space with the assumption that the space will make room. The kitchen doorway darkened, and Mary looked up before she could stop herself. Hugh Denore was not a large man in the way that made people instinctively step back. He was tall, yes, and lean in the way that comes from years of hard work rather than youth, but it wasn't his size that held a room. It was the stillness. He stood in the doorway, and he simply looked at Dolores, at the stove, at the pots, and then finally at Mary, and the entire kitchen reorganized itself around where his attention landed. He was 36 years old, and looked like a man who had decided long ago that showing what he felt was a luxury he couldn't afford. His face was angular and sun-dark, and there were lines at the corners of his eyes that could have been from squinting or from something harder to name. He wore no expression that Mary could read. He simply looked at her, and she felt looked at the way she rarely did, not catalogued, not dismissed, but actually seen. "Mr. Denore," Dolores began, "this girl says Agnes Pruitt. I heard." He hadn't taken his eyes off Mary. "Agnes wrote me. Said to expect someone." His gaze moved to the cloth bag in her hand, to the knotted hem back to her face. "You're Collins." "Yes, sir." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, someone laughed again, the same voice from before still carrying the word scraps in its wake, like something caught on a boot. Hugh Denore's jaw tightened slightly. Just slightly. He turned to look out the door at the yard for one moment, then turned back. "Sit down," he said. The words were quiet. They were absolute. "You eat like everyone else here. Every last one of you heard me." He raised his voice just enough for the last part to carry through the open doorway. Then he looked at Dolores. "Feed her properly. She starts after supper." He was gone before Mary could find a single word to give him. Dolores was already moving toward the stove. She pulled a bowl from the shelf, filled it without ceremony, cut a thick piece of bread, and set it on the table in front of the stool nearest the door. "Sit," she said. Then after a beat, "He doesn't say things twice." Mary sat. She wrapped both hands around the bowl and felt the warmth of it move up through her palms, and she made herself eat slowly and steadily, the way a person eats when they are determined to seem like someone who does not need this desperately. She ate every last bite. She didn't ask for more. She was still sitting there when the ranch hands filed past the open kitchen window, heading toward the bunkhouse, and one of them, the one who had laughed, glanced in and saw her at the table, eating the same food they'd all just had, and the smile on his face collapsed into something uncertain. Mary looked at him directly for the first time. She held his gaze just long enough for him to look away. Then she set down her spoon and stood up and started washing dishes. She was given a corner room in the house behind the kitchen. Barely a room at all, more like a large closet with a cot and a window, and she lay awake in it that first night, listening to the ranch settle around her. The sounds were different from anything she'd grown up with. Cattle in the distance, wind moving through dry grass, the occasional voice of a night hand calling out to another across the dark. She had the letter from Agnes folded on the cot beside her. She didn't need to read it anymore. She'd memorized every word 2 months ago. But she kept it there the way some people keep a stone in their pocket, not for any practical use, just to have something solid to close a hand around when the uncertainty started to feel like drowning. She thought about her mother. She did this carefully, the way you approach a wound that's mostly healed, touching the edges lightly, not pressing in. Her mother had been a practical woman, not cold, but not given to sentiment either. She had kept their household accounts in a blue ledger book that she'd maintained herself even when money was so tight, the entries were only cents. She had taught Mary to do the same. Numbers don't lie, she used to say. People lie. Numbers just sit there and tell you exactly what happened. Mary had her mother's ledger book in the bottom of the cloth bag. It was the only other thing she'd brought. She lay awake until the sounds outside had gone entirely quiet, and then she got up. She wasn't hungry. She wasn't restless. She simply could not sleep in a new place without first understanding it, and the only way she knew how to understand a place was to look at how it ran. She found Dolores's kitchen supply records hanging on a nail beside the pantry door, a loose collection of pages held together with a strip of leather. She carried them to the table and sat down in the dark with a single candle and started reading. The first thing she noticed was that the sugar order was placed every 2 weeks, regardless of how much was left, which meant there was almost always a surplus that quietly spoiled. Small waste, but waste. The second thing she noticed was that the salt pork orders had been written in 2 different hands. The first hand, small, careful, consistent, went back about 2 years. The second hand, larger, looser, with numbers that didn't quite add up to the sums written beside them, had been writing the orders for the past 14 months. She sat with that for a moment. Then she went back to the beginning and started reading again more slowly this time. By the time the candle burned to a stub, she had found 7 separate entries where the quantities listed in the order didn't match the quantities that had been noted as received. The difference wasn't enormous on any single line, but she added them up in the margin in her mother's careful small hand, and the total made her breath stop. She sat in the dark for a long time after the candle went out. Then she went back to her cot and lay down and stared at the ceiling until morning, not sleeping at all. Turning numbers over in her mind the way other people turn worry beads. Someone was stealing from this ranch, and they had been doing it for over a year. She said nothing. Not yet. She had been here one day. She had eaten at this table on the charity of a man who didn't know her name yesterday morning. She had no standing, no trust, no proof that anyone would listen to her if she spoke, and every reason to believe that the first person she told might be the very person doing the stealing. So she kept her head down, and she worked. She was fast in the kitchen, and Dolores noticed it without commenting on it, which was the closest thing to a compliment the woman seemed to offer. Mary had grown up cooking for herself and her mother, and the occasional neighbor when things got hard, which meant she could scale a recipe without thinking, and she moved through a kitchen without wasting steps. Dolores rearranged the prep schedule after 4 days to put Mary on breakfast, because Mary had the eggs done and the biscuits out of the oven by the time the hands came through the door, and that had apparently never happened before. "You've done this before," Dolores said one morning. It wasn't a question. "Since I was 8, Mary said. "My mother wasn't well some seasons. I learned to manage." Dolores grunted, which Mary had begun to understand was the woman's way of filing something away. The ranch hands, for their part, had made a kind of silent collective decision about her. The ones who had laughed that first day gave her a wide berth, now not out of respect exactly, but out of the particular discomfort of men who have been wrong-footed by someone they'd already decided didn't matter. The others, the older ones, the quieter ones, had started greeting her in the morning, nodding, asking if there was more coffee. Small, ordinary things that meant she had crossed some threshold from invisible to present. She did not see Hugh Denore again for 5 days. This was partly because he was out on the range most of each day and came in late, and partly because when he was in the house, he moved through it without drawing attention to himself, which struck Mary as strange for a man who owned everything in sight. She caught glimpses, a hat hanging on a hook that wasn't there the night before, a chair pulled out from the table at an angle she didn't leave it, in a coffee cup left on the windowsill with the handle turned precisely west. He was present. She just couldn't see him. On the 5th evening, she was restocking the pantry after supper when she heard his voice from the next room, speaking to someone she couldn't see. "What's the figure on the Abilene shipment?" His voice was flat. Not angry, just tired. "Same as last month." A voice she didn't recognize. Smooth. Too smooth, the way a surface is too smooth when something's been sanded off of it. "Feed prices went up. Can't help that." A pause. "They went up by that much." "Suppliers aren't what they used to be, Mr. Denore. You know how it is." Another pause. Longer. "Fine." And then the sound of boots on the floor and the door to the outer room closing, and silence. Mary stood in the pantry with a tin of coffee in one hand and the supply ledger in the other, and she thought about those 7 entries, the ones in the second hand, the ones that didn't add up. She thought about the smooth voice, the numbers that couldn't quite be argued with because they were explained away before the argument started. She went back to her cot that night and opened her mother's ledger book to a blank page, and she began to write down everything she remembered from the pantry records in as much detail as she could recall. Dates, numbers, discrepancies. She wrote in her mother's small, careful hand, the numbers lined up neatly in columns, and when she was done, she looked at what she had and felt something cold and certain settle in the pit of her stomach. This was not small. This was not a matter of a few dollars here and there. This was systematic. This was someone who had learned the shape of the ranch's finances and was cutting pieces from them with the careful patience of someone who knew exactly how long they could do it before anyone noticed. The ranch was bleeding, and it had been bleeding for over a year. She turned off the lamp and lay in the dark and thought about a man who had told her to sit down and eat like everyone else on the worst day of her life. She thought about what it would mean if she said nothing. She thought about the word fair. Agnes Pruitt had called Hugh Denore a fair man, and Mary had staked 31 cents and the only other option she had on that word, meaning something. She closed her eyes. She had work to do. The next morning she was at the kitchen table before dawn with every supply record Dolores could find spread out in front of her in chronological order. Dolores came in at her usual hour, saw what was on the table, and stood in the doorway for a long moment. "What are you doing?" "Trying to understand something," Mary said without looking up. "Those are Mr. Denore's records." "I know." She looked up then. "I think they're wrong, Dolores. Not by accident. I think someone's been writing them wrong on purpose." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight to it. Dolores walked slowly to the table and looked at the pages spread out there. She was quiet for a long time. Mary watched her face, watched her read the numbers, watched something shift behind her eyes, the way ice shifts when the cold underneath it is no longer cold enough. "How long?" Dolores asked. "At least 14 months, Mary said, "based on where the handwriting changes." Dolores sat down heavily in the chair across from her. She didn't say anything. She just sat there and looked at the numbers with her hands folded in her lap and in her face, Mary saw the particular expression of someone who has suspected something for a long time without having the language to say it. "You can't tell him," Dolores said finally. Mary blinked. "What?" "Not yet." The cook's voice was careful, low. "You don't know this ranch. You don't know who's involved. If you go to Hugh Denore with a pile of papers and a theory, and if the wrong person hears about it before you can prove it..." She stopped. "You need more than numbers. You need proof that can't be argued with." Mary looked at the pages on the table, at the columns of figures, at the second-hand loose and confident writing numbers it knew would be read by a man too busy and too tired and too trusting to check every line. "Then I'll get that," she said. Dolores looked at her for a long moment. Something in the older woman's expression settled into something she hadn't shown before, not warmth exactly. Recognition. "You're not just a kitchen girl," Dolores said. It wasn't a question. "No," Mary said quietly. "I'm not." Outside the window, the sun was just beginning to come up over the flat Texas land, turning the sky the color of a bruise going gold. Somewhere across the yard, a rooster announced the day with the conviction of something that has never once been wrong. Mary turned the next page in the ledger. She had a great deal of work to do before she was ready to walk into the room where the smooth-voiced man stood explaining away other people's losses, and she intended to be absolutely, irrevocably, undeniably ready. She would have one chance. She was not going to waste it. She found the second ledger on a Tuesday. It was tucked behind a loose board at the back of the pantry wrapped in oilcloth, and it would have stayed there another year at least if Mary hadn't been reorganizing the dry goods shelves and noticed that the board didn't sit flush with the ones beside it. She pressed it. It gave. She reached in with 2 fingers and pulled out something that felt like an answer to a question she hadn't quite finished asking yet. She carried it back to the table and unwrapped it carefully the way you unwrap something you already know is going to change everything. It was a record book. Same size as the official supply ledger, same kind of binding. But this one was in the second hand, the loose, confident hand she'd been tracking through the official records for 2 weeks now. And it was meticulous. Every entry dated. Every amount noted. A running total in the right margin that climbed steadily month by month like something growing in the dark where no one was looking. Her hands were perfectly still on the table. The rest of her was not. 14 months. 43 separate transactions. The total in the right margin at the bottom of the last page was $4,218. She sat back in her chair. $4,000. From a ranch that was already struggling to make its payments to the Callahan County Savings Bank. $4,000 pulled out of Denore Ranch in careful pieces like a man who understands that a slow leak is harder to find than a flood. She heard Dolores's footsteps in the yard before the door opened, and she closed the oilcloth over the ledger and set her coffee cup on top of it and picked up the week's meal plan as if she'd been reviewing it. Dolores came in, looked at her, and then looked at the oilcloth under the coffee cup. "What did you find?" she said. Mary moved the cup and slid the ledger across the table. Dolores sat down. She opened it. She read the first page and then the second, and Mary watched the color in the older woman's face do something complicated go pale first, and then come back darker, like a fire that almost goes out, and then catches harder. "Lord have mercy," Dolores said, very quietly. "I know. This is Garrett's hand." She turned 3 more pages. "This is absolutely Garrett's hand. I've seen his writing on the feed orders for 2 years." "Who is Garrett?" Dolores looked up. "Silas Garrett, the cattle broker who handles Denore's sales out of Abilene. He's been doing business with Hugh for..." She stopped. "He's been doing business with Hugh for 4 years." Mary let that sit for a moment. 4 years of relationship. 4 years of trust built carefully the way the thief had built the debt slowly in pieces until the foundation was so deep that questioning it felt like questioning the ground itself. "He has access to the ranch's accounts?" Mary asked. "Hugh gave him signing authority on the cattle sale proceeds 2 years ago. Said it was simpler. Said he trusted Garrett to handle the Abilene end." Dolores pressed her fingers flat against the open ledger. Hugh trusted him. There it was, the word that cost everything. Trust given to the wrong person at the wrong time, and now $4,000 gone and a debt to the bank growing like something with roots. "Does anyone else know?" Mary asked. If anyone else knew, Dolores said, they'd have told Hugh already. She paused. Or they're part of it. The kitchen was very quiet. "I need to see the bank records," Mary said. "The actual loan documents. Whatever Hugh has from the bank." Dolores shook her head slowly. "Those are in his office. He keeps that room locked." "Does he lock it when he's in it?" A long pause. "No." Mary looked at her hands on the table. She thought about what it meant to walk into a man's office uninvited to stand in front of him and say, "I've been reading your records without permission, and I've found something that is going to break your heart." She thought about what it meant to do that as a woman who'd arrived 2 weeks ago, asking for scraps with no standing, no title, no reason for him to believe she was anything other than what she appeared. She thought about $4,218. She thought about the word fair. "Tell me when he's in there," she said. She didn't go that night or the next. She spent those 2 days doing something she was better at than most people understood. She prepared. She went back through every supply record, every feed order, every cattle sale notation she could access, and she built a timeline. She wrote it in her mother's ledger book in columns that aligned perfectly with dates running down the left margin and figures running across the page in a grid she could read in under a minute. She cross-referenced the hidden ledger against the official one and noted every place where the two diverged, flagging each with a small mark in the margin. Her own private notation system, the one her mother had taught her. The one that meant this number doesn't belong here. She did not sleep much. Dolores brought her a plate each evening and set it at her elbow without comment. On the second night she also brought a lamp with a better wick. On the third morning, Dolores appeared at Mary's door before breakfast. "He's in the office. Been in there since before I got up. Ranch hand said he was in there with the bank papers last night too." Mary was already dressed. She closed her mother's ledger, tucked it under her arm, and walked down the hall. She knocked twice. Quietly, but clearly. The silence on the other side lasted long enough for her to understand he was deciding whether to answer. Then, "Come in." Hugh Denore was at the desk, which was the first time she'd seen him not on his feet or moving through a doorway. He looked different sitting still, more tired. The lines at the corners of his eyes were deeper this morning, and there was something about the way he was holding his shoulders, too square, too deliberate, that told her he'd been fighting with something in those papers for hours. He looked at her. Then at the ledger under her arm. Then back at her face. "Miss Collins," he said. Not unkindly, but not warmly either. Just a statement of fact. "Mr. Denore." She crossed the room without waiting for an invitation and set her mother's ledger on the edge of his desk. She did not sit down. "I need to show you something." He looked at the ledger. He looked at her. "Those are my records." "Yes, sir, some of them." She opened the ledger to the first page of her timeline. "These are my notes on your records, and on something else I found." She set the hidden ledger on the desk beside the timeline and watched his face. He didn't reach for it immediately. He looked at it, then at her. "Where did you get that?" "Behind the loose board at the back of the pantry." Something moved in his expression. Not surprise exactly, something harder than surprise. "You were searching my pantry. I was reorganizing your dry goods shelves," she said. "I wasn't looking for it. I found it, and when I did, I looked at it. I'm sorry if that was wrong." She paused. "But I'm not sorry I looked." He was very still. "Mr. Denore," she said, and now she let the steadiness in her voice carry something she usually kept out of it, not heat, but weight. "Someone has been taking money from this ranch for 14 months, over $4,000, through the cattle brokerage accounts in Abilene. The records are all there. The hand in that book is the same hand in your official supply ledger for the past 14 months. I've marked every entry where they diverge." She stopped. She had said what she needed to say. Now she waited. The clock on the wall behind him ticked. Outside, she could hear a horse being led across the yard. Everything else was absolutely quiet. He reached out and opened the hidden ledger. He turned pages slowly. She watched him read, watched his face do the thing she had watched Dolores's face do, go pale and then come back harder. His jaw set. A muscle moved in his temple. He turned to her timeline, read it line by line. She could see him checking it in his head, cross-referencing against things he knew from memory, and she watched the moment the check came back, correct his eyes still just briefly, and then moved on. He turned the last page of the timeline, read the total at the bottom, set the ledger down very carefully, the way you set down something you might otherwise throw. The silence lasted a long time. "Garrett," he said finally. Not a question. "I believe so." Dolores recognized the handwriting. His jaw tightened. "I gave him signing authority." "I know." "I trusted him." "I know." She said it without softening it, because she understood that the last thing a man in this kind of pain needed was cushioning. He needed the floor to hold. But the records are what they are, and the records say that whatever the two of you agreed to, this wasn't part of it. He stood up slowly, walked to the window, stood there with his back to her, and she let him have that because she understood that a man like Hugh Denore had been holding everything together by himself for so long that being told he'd been robbed under his own nose was not just a financial blow. It was something else entirely. It was the particular humiliation of having given someone your trust and had it used against you, and that kind of thing needed a moment to be received before it could be dealt with. She stood quietly and waited. When he turned back, his face had closed again into that unreadable stillness she'd seen in the doorway her first night. But his eyes were different now. They were looking at her with something she hadn't seen there before. Not just awareness, but the specific alertness of a man who has just realized he has been reading a situation entirely wrong. "How long have you known?" he asked. "I've suspected since my third day. I've been building the documentation for 2 weeks." 2 weeks? He said it quietly. "You've been here 2 weeks, and you found something in my books that's been there for over a year." She didn't answer that. It wasn't a question that needed answering. He picked up her timeline, looked at it again. "This notation system, where did you learn this?" "My mother kept the household accounts. She taught me." She paused. "She said numbers don't lie. People lie. Numbers just sit there and tell you what happened." Something shifted in his face, just slightly. She couldn't name it. "What do you want?" he asked. The question surprised her. She'd expected, "What do we do next?" or "Who else knows?" or even "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" She hadn't expected him to ask her what she wanted. "I want to help you fix it," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "Why?" She thought about her mother. About the blue ledger book with its careful columns. About 31 cents and a letter and a quarter-mile walked in cracked boots while men laughed at her from a fence. "Because someone should," she said. She did not tell him everything she'd been planning in those 2 weeks. Not yet. Because what she'd built in her mother's ledger wasn't just a record of the theft, it was the beginning of something larger. She had spent the late nights doing what she did best, which was reading a system until she understood it completely, and what she understood about Denore Ranch now was that the theft was the worst of the problems, but not the only one. The feed supply contracts were written at above-market rates. She'd looked up the standard rates from a cattleman's almanac she'd found in the office bookshelf. The ranch was paying 12% above what comparable operations in Callahan County were paying for the same quality of feed and had been for 2 years. Either Garrett had negotiated those contracts, which was likely, or someone else had. And either way, the number needed to change. The cattle sale timing was wrong. Hugh was selling in late summer consistently when the market was lowest, rather than holding into early fall when prices rose. Not by much, a few cents per head, but at the volume, Denore Ranch was moving. A few cents per head was not a few dollars. It was hundreds of dollars, year after year, compounding into a pattern of underperformance that looked like bad luck, but was actually bad timing. The debt to the Callahan County Savings Bank, which she had found documented in a folder she could see from where she stood, she hadn't touched it, but she could read the figure through the open cover, was substantial. She didn't know the terms yet, but she intended to. She said none of this that morning. She said, "I want to help you fix it." And she meant all of it, but she understood that a man who had just been told he'd been betrayed needed one problem at a time. Hugh Denore was not a simple man, but he was not a complicated one either. He was a man who had built something with his hands and his years, and his stubborn refusal to quit, and he had made one bad decision about trust, and it had cost him more than he knew yet. The thing about that kind of man is that you don't help him by taking over. You help him by standing beside him with better information than he had before. That was what she intended to be. The next 3 weeks moved differently than the first two had. Hugh Denore began leaving the office unlocked. She noticed it on a Thursday. She came down the hall on her way to the kitchen, and the office door was standing an inch open, and through the gap she could see a stack of papers on the corner of the desk that hadn't been there the night before. She walked past without stopping, but she noticed. The next morning the door was open again, and there was a folder on the desk with the Callahan County Savings Bank insignia on the cover. She went to the kitchen. She made breakfast. She fed 17 ranch hands, and she cleaned up, and she reorganized the coffee stores for the third time in a month, because she could not stop her brain from working, even when her hands were busy, and when the hands had all filed out, and Dolores had gone to the garden, and the kitchen was quiet. She walked back down the hall and into the office, and sat down at the corner of the desk and opened the bank folder. The loan had been taken out 3 years ago. The terms were not cruel, but they were not generous either, and the payments had been consistent until 14 months ago, which was, she noted exactly, when the second handwriting appeared in the supply ledger, and then the payments had started coming in short. Not dramatically short, just slightly. Just enough that the bank had absorbed it for a while as a temporary fluctuation, which told her the bank manager was either patient or had been given a good explanation. But the arrears had been accumulating, and the current outstanding figure was enough to cause a problem she did not want to calculate yet without the full feed cost correction. She sat back. Did the arithmetic in her head. Checked it. Did it again. The ranch had 40 days before the bank's patience ran out. She had found that line buried in the third page, a letter, not a statement, from a bank officer named Calloway dated 6 weeks ago, explaining with careful professional language that the account needed to be brought current within 60 days, or the bank would be required to consider its options. That letter was 6 weeks old. 40 days. She closed the folder, placed it back exactly as she'd found it, walked back to the kitchen and stood at the stove and stared at the wall for approximately 90 seconds. Then she picked up her pen and opened her mother's ledger to a new page and started building the case. She built it the way her mother had taught her to do anything important from the outside in. Start with what you know for certain. Build toward what you can prove. Leave the center empty until you can fill it with something no one can argue with. What she knew for certain: $4,218 removed from the operating accounts over 14 months. Garrett's hand in the hidden ledger. The correlation between his signing authority and the beginning of the discrepancies. What she could prove: the divergence between the official ledger and the hidden one. The above-market feed contract rates, which she'd verified against the almanac. The consistent late summer sale timing and its cost relative to early fall market prices. What she needed to fill the center evidence from Abilene. The actual cattle sale receipts versus what had been reported to Denore Ranch. The original versions of those contracts before Garrett's hand had touched them. She needed someone to go to Abilene, or she needed to go herself. She sat with that for a day. Then on a Friday evening, when the supper was done, and the kitchen was clean, and Dolores had gone to bed, she heard Hugh Denore's boots in the hall, and she stepped out of the kitchen and said, "Mr. Denore, when does Garrett next come to the ranch?" He stopped, looked at her in the low lamplight. 3 weeks, he said. He comes quarterly to settle the books. Will you let me be there when he does? A long pause. His face was unreadable as always, but she had learned in these weeks to read the pauses instead. This one was not reluctance. It was the particular stillness of a man choosing his words with the care they deserved. "What are you planning?" he asked. "I'm planning to have everything documented before he arrives," she said. "Every discrepancy, every contract divergence, Every figure that doesn't match what it should match, laid out so clearly that there is no room for explanation, so that when he walks into a room and tries to justify it, there is nothing to justify. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his expression that she couldn't quite read. It was complex and quiet, and she filed it away to think about later. "He's a smooth talker," Hugh said. "He's talked his way out of hard questions before." "Not with numbers," she said. "You can't talk your way around numbers. Numbers are either right or they're not." Another pause. Outside the window, the wind was moving through the grass with a sound like breathing. "My mother used to say that," Mary added. She hadn't meant to say it. It came out before she could catch it. She felt something shift in her chest and looked down at the ledger book in her hands. The silence that followed was different from the ones before. It was softer at the edges. "All right," Hugh said. His voice was quieter than usual. "You'll be there." Yum. She went to Abilene on a Wednesday. She didn't ask permission. She simply told Dolores she'd be gone overnight, packed her mother's ledger and the copied figures she needed, and caught the morning stage at the crossroads. She had $8 that Dolores had pressed into her hand. Without explanation, she had tried to refuse it, and Dolores had given her a look that ended the conversation, and she had a list of 3 things she needed to find: the Abilene Cattlemen's Exchange Records Office, the County Land Registry, and a lawyer. She found the records office first. She introduced herself as an account representative for Denori Ranch, which was not technically accurate, but was not entirely a lie either. She was representing the ranch's account, which was more than Garrett had ever honestly done. The clerk at the desk was a young man who seemed flustered by a woman in a working dress asking for sale receipts with the calm authority of someone who handles these transactions daily, and his fluster worked in her favor. He found the record she requested without asking why. She sat at the clerk's table and compared the sale receipts to the numbers in her copied figures for 45 minutes. The difference between what the cattle had sold for in Abilene and what had been reported to Denor Ranch was not on every transaction. It was on 9 of them spread across the 14 months, and the amounts varied, some small, some not small at all, but the pattern was absolutely clear once you were looking for it. Garrett had been filing adjusted sale reports. The real receipts were here. The adjusted ones were what Hugh Denor had seen. She copied every figure by hand, working quickly, her pen moving across the page in her mother's clean, careful columns. When she was done, she thanked the clerk and walked out. The lawyer she found on the 3rd Street, she tried. A small office, an older man, a face that had seen enough of Texas's legal peculiarities to not be surprised by much. She explained what she had. He listened without interrupting, which she took as a professional courtesy and a good sign. "Fraud," he said when she finished. "Clear fraud. Falsified sale reports, embezzlement through signing authority above market contract manipulation." He paused. "And this has been going on for 14 months. "Yes." "The man's name is Garrett Silas Garrett. He operates out of the Abilene Exchange." "Yes." The lawyer wrote it down. He asked her 4 more questions, each more specific than the last, and she answered all of them because she had prepared for all of them. He looked at her documentation, the copies from the exchange, her timeline, the figures from the hidden ledger she'd transcribed, and he looked at it the way a man looks at something that makes his professional life either very complicated or very satisfying, and she could tell after a moment that he'd landed on satisfying. "You have a strong case," he said. "You'll need an attorney of record in Callahan County." "I know," she said. "But I need to know first whether this is enough to bring a legal claim. Whether these numbers, the exchange records, the hidden ledger, whether that's enough to file." He looked at her over the papers. "Miss Collins, if you walked into a Callahan County courthouse with what you've shown me today, Silas Garrett would have approximately no ground to stand on." She let out a breath she had been holding, it felt, for 3 weeks. "Good," she said. "Then I have some more work to do before I take this home." She was back at Denor Ranch by Thursday evening. Dolores was in the kitchen, and when Mary came through the door, Dolores looked at her face and turned without a word and put the kettle on. Mary sat down at the table and opened her bag and laid out everything she had brought back, the copied exchange receipts. the lawyer's written assessment, her updated timeline with the Abilene figures integrated, and she sat back and looked at it all spread out on the table, and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not happiness exactly. Something quieter and more durable than happiness. The feeling of a problem that has been understood completely. The feeling of a fight you know you can win. "You look different," Dolores said, setting a cup in front of her. "I found what I needed," Mary said. "Did you find all of it?" Mary looked at the papers, at the columns, at the total she had written at the bottom of the Abilene page, the full amount, the Abilene discrepancies added to the supply account embezzlement, and the number was larger than she had expected. Larger and cleaner and more damning. "Yes," she said. "All of it." Dolores sat down across from her. She looked at the papers for a long moment, and then she looked at Mary, and her expression did something unusual. It softened. Not into pity, into something Mary didn't quite know how to name. The look an older woman gives someone younger when she sees in them something she wished she'd had at that age. "He came looking for you," Dolores said. "This afternoon. When I said you'd gone to Abilene, he didn't say anything. He just stood there for a moment and then walked back out." Mary wrapped her hands around the cup. "What do you think that means?" Dolores made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. "I think it means he's not used to someone handling his problems for him." She paused. "I think it means he noticed." Mary said nothing. She thought about the open office door. The bank folder left where she could see it. The way he'd said all right in that quieter-than-usual voice when she'd asked to be present when Garrett came. She picked up her pen and turned to a new page in her mother's ledger. Garrett was coming in 2 weeks. She had 2 weeks to make sure that when he walked through the door of Denor Ranch and opened his mouth to explain there was not a single number in the world he could hide behind. She had come here asking for scraps. She was building something else entirely now. 2 weeks was not enough time. It was also exactly enough time. Mary had learned in the months since her mother died, and everything fell apart, and she had to rebuild herself from the ground up. That time was never the right size for what you needed to do with it. You just did what you could with what you had, and you made it be enough through sheer refusal to accept otherwise. She spent the first 3 days after Abilene building the presentation. That was how she thought of it. Not a confrontation, not an accusation, but a presentation. Because accusations could be denied, deflected, argued with, emotionally countered. A presentation of numbers organized with precision and sourced with documentation could not. Numbers either matched or they didn't. The exchange receipts either aligned with what Garrett had reported or they didn't. The total was either what it was or it wasn't. She was going to walk into that room and make it impossible for Silas Garrett to breathe in any direction without running into a fact. She organized everything into 3 sections. The first was the supply account discrepancies, the figures from the official ledger against the hidden ledger, every entry flagged and dated 14 months of systematic skimming, laid out so cleanly that a child could follow it. The second was the cattle sale falsifications, the Abilene exchange receipts against the adjusted reports Garrett had filed with the ranch. 9 transactions, each one showing the gap between what the cattle had actually sold for and what Denor Ranch had been told they sold for. The third was the contract analysis, the feed supplier agreements, at 12% above market rate, with the almanac figures beside them, and a calculation showing what those inflated rates had cost the ranch over 2 years. When she added all 3 sections together and wrote the total at the bottom of the final page, her hand stopped moving for a moment. $5,641. That was what Silas Garrett had taken from Hugh Denor. Not 4,000. Not what the hidden ledger showed, because the hidden ledger was only the piece Garrett had been careless enough to write down. The full amount when you accounted for the Abilene falsifications and the contract inflation was $5,641. From a man who owed the bank $1,400 in arrears and had 34 days left to pay it. She sat at the kitchen table in the early morning dark and looked at that number for a long time. Then she picked up her pen and wrote the repayment plan. She had been thinking about this since Abilene. since the lawyer had looked at her documentation and said strong case with the confidence of a man who does not use those words carelessly. If she was going to help Hugh Denor save this ranch, she needed more than proof of the theft. She needed a path forward. Because even if Garrett was confronted and the money recovered, which was not certain, fraud cases being what they were, the bank's 40-day clock was still ticking. The arrears still existed. The above-market feed contracts still needed to be renegotiated. She worked until the sky outside the window went from black to the particular deep blue that comes just before dawn. And by the time Dolores came into the kitchen, Mary had a repayment plan in 3 scenarios: optimistic, moderate, and conservative, with the variables laid out in a grid and the minimum viable path to financial stability marked clearly. Dolores stopped in the doorway, looked at the table, looked at Mary. "You didn't sleep," Dolores said. "I slept some," Mary said. This was technically true. She had put her head down for approximately 2 hours sometime after midnight. Dolores made coffee without another word, set a cup at Mary's elbow, looked at the papers for a moment with the expression she'd had in Abilene, that quiet recognition. Then she said, "He was in the office again last night. I saw the light under the door when I got up for water. Past 2 in the morning." Mary looked up. "What's he working on?" "I don't know, but he's been different since you got back from Abilene." She paused. "Less like a man carrying something alone." Mary wrapped her hands around the cup. She didn't say anything to that, but she thought about it for the rest of the morning. She brought the full documentation to Hugh that afternoon. She knocked, he said, "Come in," and she walked to the desk and set everything down in 3 neat stacks: the supply account section, the Abilene section, the contract analysis, and then she set the repayment plan beside them and stepped back. He looked at the stacks, then at her. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He went through the first stack without speaking. She had learned by now that he read the way he did everything else thoroughly, without rushing, without performing his reactions for whoever was watching. He turned pages steadily. When he got to the running total at the bottom of the supply account section, he stopped for a moment, then kept going. The second stack took longer because the Abilene receipts required cross-referencing, and she watched him do it. Watched him go back and forth between the exchange records and the adjusted reports, checking one against the other, and she knew the exact moment he found the largest discrepancy, because his hand went flat on the table. "This one," he said. He didn't look up. "The September sale." $312, she said. That was the largest single falsification. He was quiet for a moment. "I remember that sale. I asked Garrett about it. He said the market had dropped sharply that week." He paused. "He showed me a market report." "The exchange records show the market was up that week," Mary said. "Slightly, but up. The report he showed you." She hesitated, then said it. "I think he made it." Hugh's jaw tightened. He moved to the third stack. Read the contract analysis. Looked at the almanac figures she'd set beside the feed supplier numbers. Read the calculation at the bottom. He was silent for a long time. When he finally looked up, his eyes were doing something she hadn't seen from him before. Not anger, or not only anger. Something more personal than anger. The look of a man who is re-examining every moment of the last 14 months and finding the shape of the betrayal in each one. $5,641, he said. "Yes. And the bank needs $1,400 in arrears in 34 days. She leaned forward. "Look at the repayment plan." He picked it up. "Read it." His brow furrowed at the first scenario, and she watched him work through the logic, and she could see from his expression that he was finding it the path, the one she'd marked. And she watched his face change as the numbers resolved into something that was not disaster. "This requires recovering at least the falsified sale amounts from Garrett," he said. "Yes, but you have documentation for every cent. The exchange records are the original receipts. There's no version of this where a court looks at those records and sides with him. Courts take time. I know. That's why I wrote the moderate scenario." She pointed to the second column. If you can get a partial recovery quickly, even from confronting Garrett directly before this goes legal, and renegotiate the feed contracts to market rates starting next month, the ranch can make the bank payment with what's in the current operating account. He looked at the second column. Just barely. Just barely is enough, she said. Just barely means the ranch is still yours. The word yours sat in the air between them. He set the repayment plan down. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then looked at her, and there was something in the look that she didn't know how to categorize yet. It was too layered for a simple read. "You've been here 37 days, he said. "Yes. In 37 days, you found something that's been sitting in my books for over a year." She didn't respond to that. "Why didn't you bring this to me sooner?" He said it without accusation, genuinely asking. "Because I needed it to be complete," she said. "If I'd come to you 3 weeks ago with a suspicion and some flagged entries, you would have asked Garrett. And Garrett would have explained it. And the ledger would have disappeared, and I would have lost the only leverage you had." She met his eyes directly. "I needed to wait until there was nothing left to explain away." He looked at her for a long moment. "That took considerable patience," he said. "I'm good at waiting when it matters," she said. Something shifted in his face. Not much. Just enough. "Garrett arrives in 11 days, he said. "I know. When he gets here." He stopped. Started again. "I want you in that room." She had asked for that 2 weeks ago, and he had agreed, but this was different. This was not him conceding to a request. This was him deciding. "I'll be there," she said.
Jamad.
The 11 days before Garrett's arrival changed the texture of the ranch in ways that were subtle but unmistakable to anyone paying attention. Mary was paying attention. She always was. Hugh Denore began talking to her differently. Not warmly, he was not a warm man, and she had stopped expecting warmth and started reading what was actually there instead, which was more interesting. He talked to her the way he talked to no one else on the ranch directly. Plainly. Without the particular careful vagueness that powerful men use with people they aren't sure about yet. He came to the kitchen one morning and asked her what she thought the feed contract renegotiation should open at, and she told him a number, and he nodded once and wrote it down. He came back the next day and told her the supplier's representative would be coming out Friday, and did she want to be present? She said yes. She was present. She sat in the corner of the office and said nothing for the first 40 minutes while Hugh and the supplier's man went back and forth. And then the supplier's man said a number that was still above market rate. And Hugh started to nod, the automatic nod of a man who has been accepting these numbers for 2 years, and Mary said quietly without raising her voice, "The almanac has that grade of feed at 14 cents per hundredweight lower than what you've just quoted, Mr. Hawkins. I can show you the reference if you'd like." The supplier's man looked at her. Then at Hugh, then back at her with the expression of a man who has just encountered a variable he wasn't expecting. Hugh looked at her too. There was something in his look that she would think about later, a kind of quiet recognition, as if something he'd been only half aware of had just fully come into view. The renegotiated contract came in at 11 cents per hundredweight below what they'd been paying. Not quite market rate, but close enough to matter. After the supplier's man left, Hugh stood by the window for a moment with his back to her, and then said without turning, 11 cents. "Over a full year's orders, that's better than $300, she said. He turned. "You knew the number before he said it." "I prepared for the meeting." He looked at her. "You always prepare." It wasn't a question, and she didn't treat it like one. "My mother taught me that the only time you walk into a room without knowing more than everyone else in it is when you have no choice," she said. "I generally try to have a choice." He made a sound that she realized with some surprise was a short, low laugh. She had not heard him laugh before. It suited him better than she would have expected. Tame. Garrett arrived on a Thursday. He came the way she had imagined he would, confident, easy in his movement. The kind of man who has been comfortable in every room he's ever entered, because he's always had an angle working. He was taller than Hugh by an inch, and broader through the chest, with a carefully trimmed beard, and clothes that cost more than they should have for a cattle broker working the Abilene exchange. She noted that. She noted everything. He came through the main door in the late morning, and Hugh met him in the front room, and Mary heard them before she saw them. Garrett's voice full and easy, Hugh's quieter and more careful than usual, which she understood was deliberate. She was sitting in the office when Hugh brought him in. Garrett saw her immediately. There was a fraction of a second, not quite a hesitation, more like a recalibration, and then his expression settled back into the comfortable confidence, and he smiled the way men smile when they've decided someone isn't relevant. "Mr. Denore," he said without acknowledging her. "I've got the quarterly figures. Good news on the summer tallies." "Sit down, Garrett." Hugh's voice was flat. Garrett sat, opened the leather satchel he carried, started drawing out papers. "Market was down in July, but I managed to hold the August lot until prices came back up, so the net is—" "I've seen the net," Hugh said. Garrett looked up, just briefly. Something behind his eyes adjusted. "Of course, I sent the reports ahead as always." The smile again. Easy. Practiced. "Wanted to walk you through the detail in person, though. There were some supplier issues this quarter that affected Garrett." Hugh said it quietly. Just the name. Just once. The silence that followed had a different quality than the silences Mary had learned to read in this house. This one had an edge to it. Hugh looked at her. "Miss Collins." She picked up the first stack of papers and set it on the desk in front of Garrett. He looked at it. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he's not sure is what he thinks it is, with that brief, careful neutrality of someone buying time. Then he looked up at her for the first time, and this look was different from the first one. This one was assessing, recomputing. "And you are," he said. "Mary Collins," she said. "I manage the ranch accounts." A beat. "I wasn't aware Mr. Denore had taken on an accounts manager." "He has now," Hugh said. Garrett looked at the stack. His hand moved toward it, and he turned the first page, and she watched his face. She was good at watching faces. Her mother had taught her that too, though not explicitly. Just by living the kind of life that required it. He read the first page. His expression didn't change. He was too good for that. But his breathing changed just slightly, just enough, and she noted it. "This is an interesting analysis," he said. His voice was still smooth, still controlled. "Though I'm not sure where these figures are sourced. Some of these supply comparisons don't reflect actual—" "Turn to page 4, Mary said. He turned to page 4. The hidden ledger transcription. His own handwriting documented entry by entry. The smoothness didn't crack, but it thickened, went from easy to effortful, and she could see him working behind it, looking for the door. "I can explain these," he said. "I'm sure you can," she said. Turn to page 9. Page 9 was the Abilene section, the exchange receipts beside the adjusted reports. His adjusted reports with his signature at the bottom beside the original exchange records with their own stamp and date. He looked at page 9 for a long time. The silence in the room was complete. "These receipts," he said finally. "There's a discrepancy in the filing system at the exchange. They've had record-keeping issues." "I spoke to the clerk directly," Mary said. "He confirmed the receipts are accurate. He also confirmed you were present at each of these sales." She paused. "I have his written statement." She set it on the desk. She had gone back to Abilene. She had not told Hugh this. She had gone back 4 days ago alone, and she had sat in the clerk's office and explained what she needed, and he had written the statement in his own hand and signed it, because he was at bottom an honest young man who did not want to be implicated in anything. Garrett looked at the statement. He looked at it for a long time, and then for the first time since he'd walked into the room, the confidence went somewhere else. Not dramatically. He didn't crumble. Men like Garrett don't crumble, they recalculate. But she could see the recalculation happening, could see him running through his options and finding each one narrower than the last, and she felt something very cold and very clear settle in her chest. "The total amount," she said, "across the supply account, the cattle sale falsifications, and the inflated contract rates is $5,641. She let that number sit in the room for a moment. "We have documentation for every cent." Garrett set the papers down. He looked at Hugh. "Hugh," he said. His voice had gone quiet. More personal. He was switching strategies, moving from smooth professional to old friend, which was, she noted, exactly what she'd expected. "We've worked together 4 years. You know me. Whatever these numbers look like, there are explanations." "I've seen the exchange receipts," Hugh said. His voice was very flat. "I've seen your handwriting in a book you hid in my pantry. There is no explanation for that." "You'd take her word over mine." He gestured at Mary. "She's been here 5 weeks. You don't know who she is or where she—" "I know what her numbers say," Hugh said. "And I know you just called them wrong without being able to tell me a single figure that's incorrect." He leaned forward. "If they're wrong, tell me which one." The silence stretched. Garrett did not name a figure. Because there was no figure to name. Every number in Mary's documentation was sourced and verified and cross-referenced, and there was not a single entry he could challenge without a better document than she had. And he didn't have better documents because the truth doesn't generate better documents. Only the lie needs better documents, and his lie had run out of road. He sat back. Something in his posture changed, not quite defeat, but the particular tension of a man who is accepting a new reality and already thinking about the next move. "What do you want?" he said, quietly. Mary spoke before Hugh could. "The full amount, $5,641, returned to this ranch within 30 days. His eyes moved to her sharply. 30 days is— "The ranch has 31 days before the bank's patience runs out," she said. "You know that. You've seen the loan documents. You've been watching those arrears build for a year." She kept her voice level. Even. No heat in it, just the numbers. 30 days. In full. Or the documentation goes to the Callahan County Sheriff and the attorney I've retained, and you face criminal fraud charges in federal court. Garrett stared at her. She held his gaze and did not move. "You don't know what you're starting," he said. Low, almost a warning. "I know exactly what I'm starting," she said. "I'm ending it!" The clock on the wall ticked. Twice. 3 times. Then Garrett picked up his satchel, stood, straightened his jacket with the careful deliberateness of a man reassembling himself. He did not look at the papers on the desk. He did not look at Hugh. He looked at Mary. 30 days, he said. 30 days, she said. He walked out. The front door opened and closed. Outside, the sound of his horse being brought around by one of the hands. Then hoofbeats moving away, fading into the flat distance of the Texas afternoon. Hugh didn't move. Mary didn't move. The room was completely still. Then Hugh said, "You went back to Abilene?" "Yes." "You got the clerk's statement?" "Yes." "When were you going to tell me?" She looked at him directly. "After the meeting. I didn't want to change the approach once we'd planned it, and I didn't know until I had the statement whether it would change anything." He looked at her for a long moment. "You went back there alone, paid for the stage yourself. Dolores helped." A pause. "Dolores," he said with the tone of a man who has just learned something about a person he thought he understood. "She believes in doing things properly," Mary said. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something in that direction. "So, do you?" he said. The days after Garrett left were the kind that changed the shape of a place without anyone announcing it. Hugh told the ranch hands the quarterly accounts were being restructured. He did not explain further, and the hands did not ask, because the men who had been at Denor Ranch long enough to read Hugh Denor's tone knew when a question would not be welcome. But something in the atmosphere shifted the way a room shifts when a door has been opened that was closed for a long time, when air moves through it and the staleness starts to go. Mary kept working. She always kept working. She revised the repayment plan to the optimistic scenario, now because if Garrett paid, and she believed he would, men like Garrett didn't go to federal court when they had a choice, the ranch would clear its bank arrears and have enough left to build a modest operating reserve for the first time in 2 years. She drafted a letter to the bank officer Calloway, explaining that the accounts were being brought current and requesting a formal payment schedule that the ranch could commit to. She gave it to Hugh to review. He read it at the kitchen table that evening, which was unusual. He generally took papers to the office. She was washing dishes when she heard him set the letter down, and she turned. "This is well written," he said. "Thank you." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "There's a sentence in the middle. Third paragraph, where you say the ranch is under new account management." He looked up. "You wrote new." She turned back to the dishes. "I can change that." "No." A pause. "I wanted to say dedicated. The ranch is under dedicated account management." She stopped washing. She stood at the sink for a moment with her hands in the water, and something warm moved through her chest that she was not prepared for. She hadn't been prepared for a lot of things about this ranch, about this man. "All right," she said. Her voice was steady. She was good at steady. "Mary." He said her name for the first time. Not Miss Collins, just the name plain and direct, the way he said everything. She turned. "Whatever Garrett does," he said, "whether he pays or whether this goes to court, I need you to know that this ranch—" He stopped, started again. "What you found, what you built from it. I would have lost everything." He said it plainly, without ceremony. "I need you to know I understand that." She looked at him across the kitchen, at the man who had told her to sit down and eat like everyone else on the worst day of her life, who had left his office door open and his bank folder where she could see it, and who had said dedicated when she'd written new. "You would have figured it out," she said. "No," he said, "I wouldn't have." He said it without self-pity, just honestly. "I know what I'm good at. Numbers aren't it. People aren't it. Cattle and land and work, those I know. But the kind of thinking you do—" He stopped again. "That's not something you learn. You either have it or you don't." She didn't know what to do with that. So she did what she always did. When she didn't know what to do, she kept moving. She pulled the plug on the sink, dried her hands on her apron, picked up her mother's ledger from the corner of the table. "I'll correct the letter tonight," she said. "You can send it tomorrow." She was at the door to the hallway when he said, "Mary." She stopped. "I'm glad Agnes sent you," he said. She stood in the doorway with her back to him and felt that warmth in her chest move through her again, and she thought about her mother, and about 31 cents, and about the quarter-mile she'd walked in cracked boots while men laughed from a fence, and about all the distances between where she had been and where she was standing right now. "So am I," she said. She walked down the hall to her room. She sat on the cot, and she opened her mother's ledger to a fresh page, and she sat there for a while without writing anything. Outside, the wind moved through the grass with that sound. It had like breathing, like something alive and steady and ongoing, regardless of whatever the people under it were going through. She had 28 days until Garrett's deadline, and she intended to make every single one of them count. The letter to the bank went out on a Friday. Mary had corrected the word new to dedicated and read the whole thing through one more time before sealing it, because that was what she did. She read everything twice. Her mother had told her that the difference between a careful person and a careless one wasn't intelligence. It was the willingness to look again at something you already thought you'd finished. The letter was good, clear, professional, the numbers laid out in a sequence that told the story without editorializing. Here is what happened. Here is what is being done about it. Here is the commitment going forward. She had included a partial payment amount that Hugh could send immediately drawn from the current operating account as a show of good faith to Callaway at the bank. It wasn't enough to clear the arrears. But it was enough to demonstrate that Denora Ranch was not in the posture of a failing operation. It was in the posture of an operation that had found its problem and was fixing it. She believed that distinction mattered to a bank officer. She believed that bank officers, like most people, responded to confidence backed by evidence. She sent it, and she waited. On the 14th day after Garrett walked out of the ranch office, a bank draft arrived. Not the full amount. $2,000. With a note in Garrett's hand, no greeting, no explanation, just a figure and a date indicating the remainder would follow within 15 days. Mary brought it to Hugh without ceremony. Set it on the desk in front of him. He picked it up, read it, set it down. 2,000, he said. It's a start, she said. It also means he's not going to fight. Men who intend to fight don't send money first. Hugh looked at her. You expected this. I expected he'd try to pay in installments to buy himself room to maneuver. 2,000 is enough to tell the bank we're serious, but not enough to clear us. He's hoping we take it and extend his deadline. She sat down across from him without waiting to be asked. She had stopped waiting to be asked about 3 weeks ago, and Hugh had not commented on it. We don't extend the deadline. We send the bank the 2,000 today with a note that the balance of the arrears will be cleared within 15 days. That puts Garrett and the bank on the same clock. When Garrett pays the rest, we're clear. Hugh was quiet for a moment. And if he doesn't pay the rest? Then we file, she said. We have everything we need. The attorney in Abilene is ready. But he'll pay. She said it with the certainty of someone who has read the situation from every angle and arrived at the same answer each time. Garrett is a calculating man. He calculates odds. Right now, the odds tell him paying is cheaper than federal court. Hugh picked up the bank draft again, turned it in his hand. You've thought about how he thinks, he said. I've thought about how people think when they're backed into a corner, she said. Most people, when they're out of options, do the practical thing. Even dishonest people. He looked at her for a moment, with that expression she had started to recognize, the one that was layered and quiet and carried more in it than his face was willing to show all at once. Then he said, Write the letter to the bank. I'll sign it today. She wrote it at the kitchen table in 20 minutes. He signed it, and it went out the same afternoon on the evening stage. She went back to her room that night and sat on the cot and thought about 15 days. About the number at the bottom of the repayment plan. About what it would mean when it was done. She thought about what came after. She hadn't let herself think about that yet. She had been so focused on the mechanics of saving the ranch, the documentation, the confrontation, the letter, the draft, that she had not spent a great deal of time on the question of what happened to Mary Collins once the ranch was saved. She had a job. She had a cot in a closet of a room. She had Dolores, who was not warm, but was steady, which was better. She had the work itself, which was the most reliable thing in her life. She had 31 cents when she arrived. She had something harder to name now, something that didn't fit in a cloth bag. She closed her mother's ledger and lay down without opening it. She slept better that night than she had in weeks. Dink. The second bank draft arrived on the 12th day, $3,641, the exact balance. Garrett had calculated it to the cent, which told her he had her documentation memorized, which meant he'd read it very carefully, which meant he understood that there was no margin in it, no room, no rounding, no ambiguity. Every number was exact, because she had made every number exact, and he knew it, and he had paid accordingly. Hugh was out on the range when the draft came. She signed for it herself, not because she had the authority technically, but because the writer was waiting and no one else was in the house, and she was not going to let $5,641 sit on a step. She signed Mary Collins' accounts manager Denore Ranch, and the writer tipped his hat and left. She set the draft on Hugh's desk and sat down in the chair across from it and looked at it. $5,641. Sitting there on the desk in a plain envelope representing 14 months of a man's calculated theft, and every night she'd spent at that kitchen table with a candle burning down to nothing. All of it returned. All of it sitting right there in an ordinary envelope, on an ordinary wooden desk. She heard Hugh's boots on the porch, the front door, his steps in the hall, and then he stopped in the office doorway and looked at her, and she nodded toward the desk. He crossed the room in 4 steps and picked up the envelope, opened it, looked at the draft. She watched his face. She had watched a lot of faces in the past months, and she was good at it. But Hugh Dunour's face had always been the hardest to read. It was the most controlled face she had ever encountered. Not cold, she had understood for some time now that he was not cold, but disciplined. A man who had decided somewhere along the way that what he felt was his own business and no one else's. But she saw it. Just for a moment, in the space between his eyes and the draft and some internal accounting she wasn't party to. She saw what it cost him to hold that envelope. Not relief, or not only relief. Something more complicated. Something that had to do with what it meant to have needed saving and to have been saved by the last person anyone would have expected. He set the draft down. "It's done," he said. "Almost," she said. "We need to send the bank their balance today. Once the arrears are cleared and Calloway has confirmation, then it's done." He nodded. He was still looking at the draft. "How much will be left in the operating account after the bank is paid?" "With the partial payment we already sent, and this draft after clearing the full arrears, you'll have approximately $800 in reserve." She paused. "That's more than you've had in 2 years." He was quiet for a moment. "And the feed contracts." "Renegotiated, saving roughly $320 annually at current order volumes." "The fall cattle sale." "I've been looking at the market reports," she said. "Prices have been rising through August. If you hold the fall lot until the second week of October, rather than selling in late September, the per-head price is likely to be 7 to 9 cents higher. At current herd numbers, that's an additional $400, he said. "Approximately." She stopped, looked at him. He met her eyes. "I've been reading the reports too," he said. "Since you went to Abilene the first time. I started reading them the way you look at them, with the market figures beside the sale history tracking the pattern." He paused. "You were right about October." Something moved in her chest. She recognized it as the particular feeling of being seen, not catalogued, not assessed, but actually seen, and she did not know entirely what to do with it. "You've been learning the accounting," she said. "I've been trying to understand what you do," he said. "There's a difference." She looked at him across the desk. He looked back. "Write the letter to the bank," he said. "I'll write it to the stage myself." He wrote it himself. She watched him go from the kitchen window, and then she turned back to the table and poured a cup of coffee, and sat down and did absolutely nothing for approximately 10 minutes, which was very unusual for her. Dolores came in from the garden, looked at her, looked at the empty table in front of her, and said, "Well, that's new." "What is?" "You sitting without something in your hands." Mary looked at her own hands. They were in fact empty. She closed them around the coffee cup. "It's almost over," she said. Dolores sat down. "The financial part," she said. "Yes." Mary looked at her. Dolores raised an eyebrow. "There are other parts." Dolores: "I'm just noting that in the time you've been here, I have watched that man rearrange his entire day, at least 4 times, to be in the same part of the house as you. I am noting that for informational purposes only." Mary's hands tightened on the cup. "He's been learning the accounts." "Is that what they're calling it?" Dolores said. "He's a practical man. He understands the ranch needs—" "Mary." Dolores's voice was gentle, but very firm. "I have cooked for Hugh Denore for 6 years. I have watched him work with ranch hands, suppliers, lawyers, and cattle buyers. I have never once seen him stay in a room after his business was finished." She paused. "He stays in rooms where you are." Mary said nothing. The coffee in the cup cooled. She drank it anyway. Hugh came back from the stage in the late afternoon. The bank letter was sent. The money was done. Mary was in the office going over the fall sale projections when she heard him in the hall, and then the footsteps stopped outside the office door, and she heard him stand there for a moment, just stand, not knocking, not coming in, just standing, and then the footsteps moved away toward the back of the house. She turned back to the projections. She stared at the same line for 90 seconds without reading it. Then she set the pen down and went and found him. He was in the kitchen, which surprised her. Hugh Denore did not, as a rule, come into the kitchen without a reason. He was standing at the far end of the table with a cup of coffee and the look of a man who has come somewhere without having a clear plan for what to do once he got there. She stopped in the doorway. He looked up. "The letter's sent," he said. "I know, thank you for writing it yourself." A pause. He turned the cup in his hands. "I wanted to," he said. "I wanted to be the one to do that part." She understood. After everything that had been done for him by her with her mother's ledger, and the Abilene trips, and the documentation, and the confrontation, there were not many parts left that he could do himself, and this was one of them, and she understood why it mattered. "It was the right thing to do," she said. He looked at his cup. "I've been thinking," he said. Then stopped. She waited. She was good at waiting. "When you first came here," he said slowly, "I told you to sit down and eat." "Yes. That wasn't—" He stopped again, started differently. "I want you to know that wasn't about charity. I don't run this ranch on charity, and I don't ask my people to either." He looked up. "I told you to sit because the way those men were laughing made me—" He stopped a third time, and she saw him work through something, and she did not rush him. "It made me angry," he said finally, plainly. "That's all. It was just wrong." She looked at him across the kitchen, at the man who had stood in a doorway, and said, "Sit down," in a voice that didn't need to be raised to fill the room. She thought about what it meant that he was telling her this, now months later, when the crisis was over, and the money was sent, and there was no practical reason to revisit that first evening. "Thank you," she said, "for that, and for everything after it." He shook his head slightly. "You don't thank me for after it. After it was you. You left the office unlocked," she said. "You left the bank folder where I could see it. You told the supplier's man I was your accounts manager before I'd said a word." She paused. "You were helping me help you. That's not nothing." He looked at her for a long moment. "I didn't know I was doing that." "I know," she said. "That's what made it real." The kitchen was very quiet. Somewhere outside, one of the hands called something to another and got a short answer, and then it was quiet again. Hugh set his cup down on the table, carefully, deliberately, the way he did things. "I'd like you to stay," he said. She felt something move through her, not surprise because she had felt this coming. The way you feel, weather before it arrives, something in the pressure of the air. But not unsurprise either. It was its own thing, warm and complicated and entirely her own. "I'm not planning to leave," she said. "I don't mean as help," he said. "Or as accounts manager. I mean—" He paused. His jaw was set with the effort of saying what he meant, and she found that she valued that effort more than she would have valued ease. "I mean, as a partner, in this ranch, in what it is and what it could be." She stood very still. "I know I'm not a man who says things like that easily," he said. "I'm not a man who says much of anything easily. You know that by now." "I do," she said. "But I've been watching you for 2 months. What you did with nothing with a cloth bag and a broken ledger and some numbers and a margin, you built something. You protected something that I couldn't protect myself." He looked at her directly. "I don't want to go back to running this place without that, without you." She thought about Agnes Pruitt's letter, about Fair Man and the 31 cents and the cracked boot. She thought about her mother and the blue ledger, and numbers. Don't lie. She thought about the open office door and the word dedicated, and the way he'd said her name for the first time, just Mary, plain and direct, the way he said everything that mattered. She thought about coming to a place with nothing and finding against every reasonable expectation that the place had something she could build into something real. "I came here with 31 cents, she said, "and a letter from an old woman who told me you were fair." Was she right? Yes, she said. She was. He looked at her. The quietness in his face had a different quality now, still controlled, still his, but something underneath it that was letting itself be visible. "Was that enough?" he said. "Fair?" She considered it, honestly, the way she considered everything. "It was enough to start," she said. "What came after was something else." "What would you call it?" he said. "What came after?" She looked at him across the kitchen, at the man with the still face and the deep eyes and the particular careful way he held everything close until he was sure of it. And she thought about what to call the thing that had grown in the space between a locked office door and an open one, between Miss Collins and Mary, between a bowl of soup on a stool and a draft for $5,641 on a plain wooden desk. "I'd call it earned," she said. Something shifted in his face, quietly, completely like a door opening inward. "Then stay," he said, "as an equal, as a partner, as—" He stopped. "As whatever you want to be here." She looked at him for a long moment. "I'll stay," she said. He nodded once. The nod of a man who has made a decision and is at peace with it. He picked up his coffee cup. She picked up hers. They stood on opposite ends of the kitchen table and drank their coffee in a silence that was not empty at all. It was full of something that neither of them needed to name yet, because it was there regardless of the name, solid and real, and built from 2 months of hard work and harder honesty. The confirmation letter from Callaway at the Callahan County Savings Bank arrived 9 days later. Mary opened it herself. Hugh was out on the range as he was most mornings, and Dolores brought it in from the rider and set it on the table in front of Mary without a word. She broke the seal and read it standing up. "The account is current. The arrears have been cleared in full. Dunor Ranch remains in good standing with this institution. We look forward to a continued relationship." She set it down on the table. She stood there for a moment. Just stood. Then she picked up her pen and turned to a new page in her mother's ledger. At the top she wrote the date. Below it she wrote, "Account current, ranch clear." And below that, in the same small careful hand, "All of it, done." She looked at what she'd written. She thought about her mother, about the blue ledger, about all the years of careful columns and honest numbers, and the lesson underneath all of it, which was not really about numbers at all. It was about seeing things clearly, about refusing to look away from what the numbers were actually saying, even when what they said was hard. Her mother had been a woman who saw things clearly, who had raised a daughter to do the same. Mary closed the ledger. When Hugh came back in at midday, she was at the kitchen table with the confirmation letter and a plate of food she'd made without thinking about it, just made it the way she made everything now, as part of the fabric of the day. He came in, and she slid the letter across the table toward him. He sat down. "Read it." Set it down. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You came here asking for scraps." He said it slowly, like something he'd been turning over. "And you gave me back my entire life." She looked at him across the table. "I didn't come for scraps," she said. "I came because I had nowhere else to go." He nodded, not the decisive nod from before. This one was slower, more inward, like he was accepting something, placing it somewhere permanent inside himself. "Then this is where you go," he said. "From here on." She looked at the confirmation letter, at the ledger beside her, at the man across the table who had told her to sit down and eat on the worst day of her life, and had meant it the way the best things are meant, simply without performance, because it was right. "Yes," she said. "This is where I go." She pushed the plate of food toward him. He looked at it, then at her. "You made this," he said. "Someone has to feed you," she said. The corner of his mouth moved, and this time it made it all the way to a smile, real brief, a little rusty, the smile of a man who doesn't use it often enough, but means it completely when he does. He pulled the plate toward him and ate. She opened her ledger to a new page. Outside, the September wind moved through the dry grass of Callahan County, with that sound like breathing, like something steady and ongoing and alive. And Dunor Ranch sat under it the way it had sat under 1,000 seasons before this one, except that now, for the first time in 2 years, it was not bleeding. It was not being hollowed out from the inside by careful hands in the dark. It was solid. It was solvent. It was against all the odds that had been quietly stacking against it for 14 months, still standing. And so was she. Mary Collins picked up her pen and began writing the October projections, because the fall cattle sale was in 3 weeks, and she had done the market analysis, and she knew exactly what Hugh Denor's herd was worth, down to the cent, and she intended to make sure every last dollar of it came home where it belonged. The October cattle sale changed everything in ways that Mary had calculated, and some she had not. She had projected 7 to 9 cents above the late September rate. The actual number came in at 11 cents above. Hugh came back from Abilene. He had gone himself this time. No broker, no intermediary. Just Hugh Denor and his herd, and the exchange records she had prepared for him, organized in a folder with every comparable sale from the past 3 years tabulated, so that any buyer who tried to lowball him would be doing it in front of a man who knew exactly what the market had paid for equivalent cattle in equivalent condition over 36 consecutive months. He walked into the kitchen that evening and set a figure on the table in front of her. She looked at it. She looked at him. 11 cents, she said. 11 cents, he said. Per head, on the full lot. She did the arithmetic in her head before her pen reached the paper. It was a reflex by now automatic as breathing. The number she arrived at made her set the pen down. Hugh, she said. I know, he said. That's enough to. I know, he said again, and this time there was something in his voice that she hadn't heard there before. Not satisfaction exactly, and not pride, but something adjacent to both of them. Something that sounded like a man allowing himself for the first time in a very long time to believe that things were actually going to be all right. She picked the pen back up and wrote the number in the ledger, added it to the operating balance, subtracted the upcoming winter feed order at the new renegotiated rate, added the projection for the spring calf sales based on current herd composition, ran the full 12-month forward look she'd been building in her head for 3 weeks, and when she got to the bottom of the column, she drew a single line under it and looked at what was there. Denor Ranch was not just solvent. It was stable. For the first time in 2 years, it had forward momentum instead of a hole to climb out of. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling. Well, she said. Hugh pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He was still dusty from the ride. He hadn't even taken off his hat yet. He just looked at her across the table with that particular stillness of his and said, Say it. Say what? Whatever you're thinking. You get quiet when you're thinking something important. She looked at him. I was thinking that this is what it's supposed to look like, she said. A ranch that works, not fighting every month to stay alive, just working. He nodded slowly. It'll take another year to build a real reserve, she said. The kind that means a bad season doesn't threaten everything. And the bunkhouse wages need to be restructured. Some of these men have been here 5 years, and they're still on starting wages, which means you're one bad offer from a neighboring ranch away from losing your best hands. He raised an eyebrow. I've been meaning to address that. I know, I saw it in the wage records in August. She pulled a folded page from the back of the ledger. I drafted a new structure. Nothing dramatic, a seniority scale with 3 tiers. It'll cost approximately $40 more per month, but it'll cut turnover, and the cost of replacing experienced hands is higher than $40. He took the page. Read it. She watched him move through it, and she could see him thinking, could see the rancher's brain working the man who understood cattle and land and labor doing his own cross-check on the numbers, and she let him do it. This is fair, he said. That's what I was going for, she said. He looked at the page a moment longer. Then he set it on the table between them. Implement it, he said. Starting next month. She nodded, wrote herself a note in the margin of the ledger. He watched her write it. Then he said, Mary. Stop working for 10 minutes. She looked up. He was looking at her with that expression, the layered one, the one she'd been learning to read for 3 months now. There was something in it tonight that was different from before, something slightly more open than he usually allowed, and she thought it might have something to do with 11 cents per head and a number on a kitchen table and the specific relief of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has just been allowed finally to set it down. All right, she said. She closed the ledger, put down the pen. He reached across the table and poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot Dolores had left on the stove and slid one toward her. Then he sat back and drank his and looked at nothing in particular, and she drank hers and did the same, and it was comfortable in the way that things are comfortable between people who have been through something real together and don't need to perform anything for each other anymore. After a while he said, "When I was 17, my father lost this ranch." She didn't move, didn't speak, just held her cup and listened. "Not the way I almost lost it," he said. "To cards. He was a gambling man, good at almost everything except knowing when to stop." He paused. "He got it back, eventually worked it back over 4 years, dollar by dollar. But I watched those 4 years. I watched what it did to him to lose something he'd built and have to rebuild it from nothing." His jaw tightened slightly. "I told myself I'd never let that happen, that I'd be too careful, too smart." "You were careful," she said. "I was careful about the wrong things," he said. "I watched the cattle, the land, the weather. I watched everything I could see." He looked at the ledger on the table. "I didn't watch the books." "Most men don't," she said, not as an excuse, just as fact. "I should have." He said it plainly, the way he said hard things without flinching, without asking for absolution. "I gave a man my trust and my signing authority, and I stopped checking." He paused. "That was my failure, not his." She thought about that. "He deceived you deliberately," she said. "Over a long period of time, with considerable skill. Calling that your failure is—" "It's accurate," he said. "He could only do what he did because I let him. That's mine to own." He drank his coffee. "But it's also done, and the ranch is standing, and the books—" He looked at her. "The books are something I'll never stop checking again." "Good," she said. "Because of you," he said. She shook her head. "Because of what happened. I was just the one who was there." He looked at her directly. "No," he said. "Not just the one who was there. Don't minimize that. I spent 2 months watching you do something I couldn't do. I watched you find what was wrong and document it and prove it and confront it and fix it. And I want you to sit here and let me say that plainly without arguing me out of it." She closed her mouth. "You saved this ranch," he said. "You saved what my father rebuilt and what I've worked for 18 years. And I am not going to spend the rest of my life pretending that was incidental." The kitchen was very quiet. "All right," she said softly. He nodded, drank his coffee. She drank hers. Outside, the October wind had a different quality from the summer wind, drier, sharper, with more purpose to it. The kind of wind that means the season is changing for real, not just threatening to. Mary had always been good at reading what things meant. She read that wind now and felt something shift in herself, the same way the season was shifting outside, not an ending, but a turn. The point at which one thing becomes another. Word traveled the way it does in a county where everyone knows which ranches are struggling and which ones aren't. And by November, people had noticed that Dunor Ranch was not struggling anymore. The first signal was the Abilene sale. The exchange talked the way exchanges do, and the number that Hugh Dunor had gotten for his fall lot 11 cents above the going rate without a broker with his own documentation in hand, circulated through the cattlemen's community, the way good numbers always did. Men talked about it at the feed store, at the land office, over coffee at the hotel in Abilene, and the dry goods counter in Baird. The second signal was the renegotiated feed contract. Word of that got out through Hawkins, the supplier's representative, who had told the story to at least 3 other ranchers in the county as a way of explaining why his rates were going to need a general review. He hadn't meant it as an advertisement for Mary Collins's abilities, but that was what it became. The third signal was the wage restructuring. The Dunor Ranch hands talked. Men who had been on starting wages for 3 and 4 years and had quietly accepted it as the way things were found themselves, suddenly on a tiered scale, with raises that were not enormous but were real and consistent and most importantly explained. Mary had written a 1-page document for each tier, simple and plain, so that every man on the ranch knew exactly what he was earning, and why, and what the next step looked like. 3 of those men had gone home and told their wives, and 2 of those wives had told their neighbors, and within 6 weeks there was a general understanding in Callahan County that something had changed at Dunor Ranch. People began to ask Hugh what was different. He told them the truth. "I hired good help," he said. The first person to come to Mary directly was a rancher named Holloway, who ran a mid-sized operation 20 miles east, and whose books were, as he put it, not in the best order. He came on a Tuesday morning, hat in hand, and asked to speak to whoever was managing the Dunor accounts. Mary was at the kitchen table. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she'd been getting from men in Callahan County since September, the slight recalibration, the adjustment from expecting something to finding something else. She had stopped being bothered by it. She had started being amused by it instead, which Dolores had noted and approved of. "I heard you do accounts work," he said. "I do," she said. "Sit down." He sat. He explained his situation not as badly as it might have been, but badly enough. Disorganized records, above-market supplier agreements, a bank payment that was becoming difficult to meet. The familiar shape of a ranch that was being managed by a man who was excellent at ranching and had never been taught to read a ledger. She listened without interrupting. She asked 3 questions when he was done. He answered them. She thought for a moment and then told him what she thought was wrong and what she thought could be done about it clearly and directly and without hedging. He looked at her when she finished. "How long would it take," he said, "to audit your records and build a correction plan? If you bring me everything, every ledger, every contract, every bank letter, about 2 weeks. And to put it right, depends on what I find," she said. "But I've yet to find a problem that didn't have a solution." He nodded slowly. "What would you charge?" she told him. She had thought about this, had thought about it since the day Dolores had said there are other parts, and she had understood what she was building here was not just a saved ranch, but a capability, a skill that was hers and that the county apparently needed. Holloway did not argue about the fee. He said he'd be back Thursday with the ledgers. She went to Hugh that evening and told him about Holloway. Hugh was quiet for a moment. Then, "You want to take on outside work?" "I want to keep doing your books," she said immediately. "That doesn't change. This ranch comes first. But there are ranches in this county running the same problems you had, and I can help them, and—" She paused. "I don't want to do anything you're not comfortable with." He looked at her. Something moved in his expression. "You're asking my permission." "I'm asking your opinion," she said. "There's a difference." He thought about it. Genuinely thought, which she appreciated, because a less honest man would have answered faster. "It's your skill," he said finally. "It belongs to you. If you can help Holloway and the others without shortchanging this ranch, then you should." He paused. "But charge what it's worth. Don't let them talk you down." She thought about the number she'd told Holloway. "I won't," she said. "Good," he said. And then after a beat, "You already told him a number, didn't you?" "Yes." "And he didn't argue?" "No." Hugh nodded with the expression of a man who is not entirely surprised. "Good," he said again, and the word carried more in it than it usually did: approval and something warmer underneath it. Something she had learned to receive without deflecting, which had taken more practice than she would have expected. Holloway's books took 11 days. She found 2 supplier contracts at inflated rates, a wage ledger that hadn't been updated in 3 years, and a record-keeping gap that was costing him clarity on his cattle inventory. He didn't actually know how many head he had within about 40 animals, which meant he couldn't plan his sales accurately, which meant he was consistently selling at the wrong time. She built him a corrected ledger from scratch, color-coded, cross-referenced, with a forward projection for the next 12 months and a note on what the spring market was likely to do based on the trend data she'd been tracking. He sat at his own kitchen table, looking at it for a long time. "My father kept books like this," he said finally. "He was a careful man." "Careful men teach careful daughters," Mary said. Holloway looked at her. "Your father, my mother," she said. He nodded slowly. "Well," he said, "she did a fine job of it." She took the fee. She put it in a separate ledger, the one she'd started keeping for herself, because she was her mother's daughter, and she kept track of everything. She wrote the amount in the right column and drew a line under it, and looked at it for a moment before closing the book. It was hers. Earned, documented, undeniable. Hers. By December, she had 2 more clients. Small operations, both of them men who had heard about Holloway's books through the county network, and come to Dunor Ranch with the same hat-in-hand presentation and the same disorganized ledgers and the same fundamental problems wrapped in different specifics. She handled them consecutively, and she handled them well, and word continued to move through Callahan County the way truth moves when it has evidence behind it steadily without drama into every corner. Hugh watched all of this with an attentiveness he didn't make obvious, but she had learned to read. He was a man who noticed everything and said a fraction of it, which meant that the things he did say carried the full weight of all the things he'd held back. She had come to value his words precisely because of their scarcity. One evening in December, he came into the office while she was finishing the Dunori books for the month and set a cup of tea at her elbow without comment. She said thank you without looking up. He sat in the chair across from the desk, the chair she usually sat in, which she noted, and was quiet for a moment. "There's a man in Baird," he said. "Runs the land registry. He's been asking about you." She looked up. "About me specifically. About who's been doing the ranch accounting in the county. Your name keeps coming up." He paused. "He wants to know if you'd consult on a dispute between 2 ranchers over a shared water source. Says the financial records involved are complicated." She set down her pen. "A legal dispute." That's what he said. She thought about the lawyer in Abilene, about sitting across from him with her documentation spread on his table and watching him say strong case with professional conviction. She thought about what it had felt like to walk into that records office and ask for the exchange receipts and have the clerk find them because she had asked with the authority of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for. "I'm not a lawyer," she said. "He's not asking for a lawyer," Hugh said. "He's asking for someone who can read financial records and explain them clearly." He looked at her. "You can do that." "Yes," she said. "I can do that." He nodded. "I told him I'd pass on his interest." "Thank you," she said. She picked up her pen, then put it back down. "Hugh. How long have people been asking about me?" He was quiet for a moment. "Since November," he said. "At least." "And you're telling me now?" "I was waiting until you'd finished Holloway and the other 2, he said. "Didn't want to distract you while you had work in progress." A pause. "You don't like being interrupted mid-project." She stared at him. "You've been managing the timing of information you share with me based on my work schedule." "Yes," he said simply. She did not know what to do with that. It was one of the most considerate things anyone had ever done for her, and he had said it as though it were completely ordinary. She looked at him across the office in the December lamplight and felt something in her chest that was beyond warmth now, something with more permanence to it, something that had been building since a first night and a bowl of soup and a knotted hem and a man who didn't raise his voice to fill a room. "You pay attention," she said. "So do you," he said. She looked back at her ledger. "I'll meet with the man in Baird," she said. "I'll ride with you," he said. She looked up. "If you want," he added. "You don't need me there, but I'd like to go." She held his gaze. "I'd like that too," she said. The Baird consultation led to 3 more. The water rights dispute had records going back 11 years, and untangling them required the kind of sustained, careful attention that Mary had been practicing since she was 8 years old at her mother's kitchen table, and she untangled them methodically and built a presentation for the county arbitrator that was so clear and so sourced that both parties accepted the determination without appeal, which the arbitrator told her afterward had never happened before in his 12 years on the bench. Word of that traveled faster than anything previous. By February, she had a ledger of her own clients that was separate from the Dunor books, and she kept both with equal care, and the Dunor books remained what they had been since October. The cleanest, most forward-projected, most clearly organized ranch accounts in Callahan County. Which was not her opinion, but the opinion of the bank officer Calloway, who had said so in a letter that she had read twice and then filed without showing anyone. She told Hugh about the letter that evening. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Calloway put that in writing. He did. That man has never put a compliment in writing in his life, Hugh said. He once told me my cattle were adequate, and I thought he was being generous. She laughed. She did that more often now. It surprised her sometimes, not that she was laughing, but the ease of it, the way it came without self-consciousness, the way this place had become somewhere she laughed. Hugh watched her laugh with an expression she had finally, after 5 months, learned to read completely. It was not complicated when you knew what you were looking at. It was simply a man looking at someone he loved, not performing the fact of it, not announcing it, just allowing it to be present in his face, because she was in the room and he had run out of reasons to keep it somewhere else. She looked at him. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. And then, after a beat, everything. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she picked up her pen. "I'm finishing the February projections," she said. "I know," he said. He didn't move. She wrote 3 lines. Stopped. "Hugh." "Yes." "You're staring." "I know," he said. "I've earned the right to." She set the pen down, turned to face him fully. He was sitting in the chair across from the desk. Her chair, still always her chair, with his coffee and his particular stillness, and the expression that she now knew meant everything. "There's something I want to say," she said. "Say it." She thought about how to put it. She was precise with numbers, because numbers had to be exact. Words were harder. Words had more give in them, more room for misinterpretation, more ways to mean one thing and land as another. She had been careful with words her whole life for exactly this reason. But she had also been brave enough when it mattered to walk into a cattle broker's domain with nothing but the truth and make it be enough. "I know what I came here as," she said. "And I know what I am now, and I know those are different things. And I know the distance between them is partly you." She paused. "The way you let me work. The way you trusted what I found. The way you said, 'dedicated' when I wrote new. Those things mattered." She looked at him directly. "They built something in me that I didn't know I needed built." He was very still. "I'm saying thank you," she said. "And I'm saying it means something. Not just the gratitude, the whole of it." She stopped, started again. "I came here with 31 cents, and I was afraid to ask for a full plate because I thought I wasn't worth one. And you told me to sit down. And every day since then, you have, without ever making a production of it, treated me as someone who was worth the whole plate." She felt something tighten in her throat and let it be there. "I don't take that lightly." Hugh set his coffee cup down on the desk. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and looked at her from that small distance and said, "You were never the one who didn't deserve the plate. You were the one who walked in the door already worth more than the whole table. I just had the sense to see it." He paused. "Eventually." "Not immediately," she agreed. "No," he said. "Not immediately. I'm not always fast." "You're thorough," she said. "That's better." The corner of his mouth moved. "Is it?" "Thorough means you don't make mistakes," she said. "Fast men make mistakes." He looked at her for a long moment. "Mary Collins," he said. Her full name, plain. The way he said everything that mattered to him. "Hugh Dunor," she said. He stood up. He crossed the office, and he stood in front of her, and he was close enough that she had to look up slightly, which she didn't mind. She had stopped minding a great deal of things she used to keep careful distance from. "I'd like to ask you something," he said. She waited. "I'd like to ask you to stay here," he said. "Not as help, not as accounts manager, not as consultant." He paused. "As my wife." The office was absolutely still. She looked at him. At the sun-dark face and the careful eyes and the lines at the corners that she knew now came from both squinting and from the harder thing. At the man who had left his door open and his documents where she could find them, and who had never once in 5 months made her feel like less than the full plate she was sitting in front of. She thought about her mother, about 31 cents, about Agnes Pruitt's letter and the word fair and the quarter-mile walked in cracked boots while men laughed. She thought about 11 cents per head and a confirmation letter from a bank and a client ledger that was growing and a county that was learning her name. She thought about being worth the whole table. "Yes," she said. He nodded. Once. Slowly. The nod of a man receiving something real. He reached out and took her hand carefully, the way he did everything with a deliberateness that meant he had thought about it and held it for a moment in both of his. She looked at their hands. His were rougher than hers, larger, the hands of 18 years of working land. Hers were ink-stained and precise, her mother's hands. "I should finish the projections," she said. "Yes," he said. He didn't let go of her hand. She looked up. He was almost smiling. Spring came to Callahan County the way it always did with wind. First, then warmth, then green, pushing up through the dry grass, as if it had been waiting all along and had simply needed the conditions to be right. Denor Ranch was not the same place it had been 9 months ago, and everyone who came within its fence line knew it. Not from anything dramatic or announced. From the accumulated evidence of 100 small things done correctly consistently without fanfare, the kind of evidence that doesn't lie. The bunkhouse housed 12 hands, now 3 more than the summer before, because the wage structure had made it worth a man's while to ride out and ask for work at Denor rather than somewhere else. The supply contracts were all renegotiated and in writing with Mary's signature beside Hugh's on every one, because Hugh had put her name on the accounts in February and informed the suppliers that either name was binding. The cattle herd was larger, healthier. The feed system she had fixed the previous autumn had held through winter without a single shortage, which was the first time in 3 years that had happened. She knew it was the first time in 3 years because she had the records going back 3 years and she had read all of them. Her own client ledger held 9 names, not 9 ranches in crisis. Some of them had come to her simply because they were building something and wanted to build it right from the beginning, which told her that the county's understanding of what she offered had evolved from emergency resource to something more foundational. She worked those 9 accounts with the same precision she brought to Denor's books, and not one of them had given her a number she couldn't eventually account for or a problem she couldn't eventually solve. The water rights presentation she had given in Baird had resulted in a standing invitation from the county arbitrator to consult on future cases, which she had accepted, which meant she was now something she had not anticipated being when she walked off a lame wagon in Callahan County with a cloth bag and 31 cents. She was quietly and without ceremony a fixture of how the county handled its complicated financial business. She thought about her mother every day, not with grief the way it used to be sharp and close, something to approach carefully at the edges. Now it was different. It was the way you think about someone who is still with you in the most durable sense, whose voice you carry, whose hands you see in your own. Numbers don't lie. People lie. Numbers just sit there and tell you what happened. She had told that to Hugh that first morning in the office, and he had looked at her in that way he had, and she hadn't known yet what that look meant. She knew now. She had learned the full vocabulary of Hugh Denor's face over 9 months of close attention, and she knew that look, the one that was layered and quiet, and carried more than the surface showed, meant that something she said had landed somewhere permanent in him. Good things deserved permanent places. The evening it happened, the evening she would think of afterward as the one that closed the last distance, was in May. She had been working late on the spring projections, as she often did in May, because May was when the year's shape became clearest, and she liked to have the full 12-month picture in hand before the spring sale. Hugh had been out since morning. She heard him come in around 8, heard him in the kitchen, heard the sounds of a man who has been outdoors all day, re-establishing contact with the indoor world. Then she heard something else, the sound of dishes, deliberate, careful. The particular sound of someone who doesn't cook often, but is being thorough about it. She set down her pen. She listened for a moment to make sure she was hearing what she thought she was hearing. Then, she got up and walked to the kitchen. Hugh was at the stove. This was remarkable in itself. She had never seen Hugh Dunor at the kitchen stove. He had his back to her, and he was focused with the full attention he brought to everything, which meant he was doing something with considerably more care than his skill level required. On the table was a plate, a full plate. More than full, deliberately generous, the kind of plate you assemble for someone you want to make something clear to. Not scraps. Not a filled bowl pushed across a table by a cook following orders. A feast. A real one, from what she could see. He had clearly raided Dolores's pantry with purpose. She stood in the doorway. He turned. Saw her. Something crossed his face that was not quite embarrassment. Hugh Dunor was not built for embarrassment, but was in the neighborhood of it. Vulnerability, maybe. The specific look of a man who has done something that exposes what he means and is not going to retreat from it. Sit down, he said. She sat down. He carried the plate to the table and set it in front of her. Then he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down and folded his hands on the table and looked at her with the directness that was his most consistent quality. The thing about him she had trusted first and trusted most. I was blind when you arrived, he said. He said it slowly, with the weight of a man saying something he has thought about carefully and arrived at honestly. I saw a woman in a torn dress with a cloth bag. I saw someone asking for scraps. He paused. I didn't see what you were, what you actually were. And I want to say that plainly. She looked at the plate in front of her, at the fullness of it. She thought about the bowl of soup on a stool in a kitchen on a hard evening in summer. She thought about how far that bowl was from this plate. She thought about everything that existed in the distance between them. 2 months of candles burning down to nothing. A trip to Abilene alone, a smooth-voiced man's careful face going still in front of columns of numbers he couldn't argue with. A word changed from new to dedicated, a hand held in an office in December. You weren't blind, she said quietly. You just hadn't seen me work yet. He shook his head. I'm not letting myself off that easy. She looked at him. You came to this door and you asked for whatever was left, he said. And the men outside laughed. And something in me... He stopped. I told you to sit down because something in me knew that was wrong. Not because I saw who you were, just because I knew that was wrong. He met her eyes. But you were never the one asking for scraps. You were never the one at the bottom of anything. You walked in this door carrying more than anyone on this ranch, and nobody knew it, including me. She felt the warmth in her throat that had been building since he started speaking. People who are hungry for respect, she said softly, never settle for scraps. He looked at her. No, he said. They don't. She picked up her fork. She looked at the plate in front of her, at the care in it, at the clear evidence of a man who rarely cooks doing this particular thing on this particular evening, for a reason that needed no explanation. She ate. He watched her and then poured himself coffee and sat across from her and was exactly as present as he always was, fully quietly without performing it, and the kitchen held them both the way it had held them through every version of the months before, from the first night she'd washed dishes at that sink. To the February evening, he'd said her full name and asked her something that had changed the shape of everything. When she finished, she set down the fork. She looked at him. You served a feast, she said. You built one, he said. Out of nothing. Out of a cloth bag and 31 cents and a broken ledger. You built a feast for this entire ranch and everyone on it. He looked at her steadily. I just put it on a plate. She looked at the table between them, at the ledger she'd left in the office with the May projections half finished, at the empty plate, at the man across from it who had given her at the lowest point of her life the thing she needed most, not pity, not charity, but a chair at the table. The same as everyone else. Not less, not more, the same. And from that chair she had built everything that came after. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. He turned his palm up and closed his fingers around hers without hesitation, without ceremony. the way he did everything that was real. "Thank you," she said, "for the chair." "Thank you," he said, "for sitting in it." Outside, the May wind moved through the new green grass of Callahan County, and Denor Ranch stood under it, the way things stand when they have found their foundation, not rigid, not perfect, but deep-rooted and honest, and built to last the way every good thing is built from nothing, by people who refused to believe that nothing was all they had. Mary Collins had arrived at this place with 31 cents and a torn dress and a question in her eyes that she had not known how to ask. She had found her answer in the numbers in the work, in a man who said, "Sit down," when he could have said nothing, in the distance between a bowl of soup and a feast, in all the long and ordinary and extraordinary days that had filled that distance and made it mean something permanent. She was no longer the woman who had whispered for scraps at a stranger's kitchen door. She was the woman who had turned those scraps into everything, and she had never not for a single day been anything less.